afternoon. I'm Saul Anderson. I'm the president and CEO of the Evanston Community Foundation. Once again, so glad to have you all in our community today. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about the reparations work happening in partnership, or under the leadership, I should say, of our community at ECF. Talk a little bit about our journey that brought us to the point where we were prepared to take on this work, how we're trying to take it on now and kind of use it as a model for partnering. We primarily come from the lens of working with the Community Foundation. There are, I believe, some specific reasons why community foundations are great partners for these types of efforts. But interestingly, some may know there was one of our guests, one of the folks joining us today, is a gentleman by the name of Marcus Walton. He's the president and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. They are a national convener of funders, and he and I were talking about trying to bring together more resources for foundations of all different backgrounds to talk more about how we can jump into this work. So as this symposium grows, hopefully we'll be able to have more dynamic conversations about foundation partnerships moving forward. I always sort of say this before I talk. So I am, my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather are all Church of God in Christ ministers, so sometimes I get a little long-winded. If you all need to pause me and ask a question, please feel free to do so. I'm happy to do that, but I'll obviously make time at the end, and I think we got a little bit of, it's a pretty long session, so, but yeah, with those caveats out of the way, I'd love to just kind of jump in and share a little bit about what we're talking about today. I just want to give a brief sort of explanation of what a community foundation is and so how it differs from others. A little bit of a history of the Evanston Community Foundation. Talk a little bit about how we sort of built this philosophy of Ubuntu into our efforts, how that fed into our strategic plan, which fed into reparations, and how that might be a model for how reparations can happen in partnership with local community foundations, the community foundation in your community, and then move forward from there. So community foundations, I think, are unique little outliers, I guess, in the foundation world. So basically what a community foundation does is we raise money from a local geographic area to build an endowment that we invest back into that same geographic area, right? And so our fund source sort of differs a little bit, right? It's not usually the product of one family's wealth or a corporation's wealth. It really is the collected support from the entire community. We're usually the only foundations that fundraise kind of on an annual basis, right? A few of us are large enough that we don't have to do that. So some of you in the city of Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust is a community foundation. They're one of the larger ones in the country. East Bay has a large community foundation. There's several community foundations that are well over $1 billion in assets. We are not one of those. We have ambitions and dreams though. So, again, our focus really should just be about improving the lives of the people who live in the community where we raise the funds from. We carry kind of different types of funds as well, which is another unique thing. So designated funds is sort of a catch-all term for a lot of different types of funds, but it's just used to support a specific area or designated charities. Those can also sort of be donor-advised funds. So one of the unique sort of fund types that we hold is we can hold funds for individual donors. They will hold those in our endowment. And so you can, someone who has like philanthropic interests can set up a donor-advised fund with a community foundation. The only other bodies that can do this, you might hear of like Fidelity Charitable or places like that. They hold donor-advised funds as well. But we're the foundation end of that. And so that person can make their gift to whatever entity they want to support, or whatever 501c3 they want to support, in partnership with the community foundation. There are some differences between doing it that way. From the donor's perspective, you get the advantage of, you can make, if you're making a gift to an individual organization, you can select that organization and make that check, make that payment, and make that donation. If you make gifts throughout the course of the year into a donor advised fund, you get the tax benefit right then. So if you get the tax benefit in year one, you can make the gift in year two. It's typically why donors do it, or you can build it up over time and make larger gifts if you want to. Some people make gifts and just take right out from them. And I'm going a little bit into donor advised funds because there is a lot about donor intent. There's actually a reason that community and foundations, I think, are good partners here. But that, you can really make a gift really around a lot of your specific things. Once you do that, the community foundation does have a certain type of control. I always tell people, if somebody says, I want to make a gift to the NRA out of our foundation, we're probably going to say that we're not the foundation partner for you. And we get a chance to say that, and we can say no, because once they give the money to us, they have gotten their tax benefit from it, and so they can't just make gifts anywhere. And so there are some restrictions, right? We don't have to just do anything that a donor wants to do, but we try to follow donor intent, because people wouldn't partner with us if they didn't. Field of interest funds is another specific one. Oh, sorry, another designated fund type that you might have would be an agency fund. So we can actually hold funds. So if a community organization raises more money than they need to keep their doors open, their lights on for the year, we can hold funds for those organizations, hold them in our endowment, keep it as a rainy day fund. Many of you with community organizations, during the pandemic, a lot of our partners, our friends in community struggled with not having resources to be able to kind of weather the challenges that the pandemic brought in terms of funding. And so a designated fund might also be something that somebody calls an agency fund. Folks are familiar with scholarship funds, we hold those. So field of interest fund could be if somebody says, and this is another type of place where things might arise, is I care about young people and I want all of my donations to go to any type of grant that might support young people, people under the age of 18, people under the age of 12, boys, girls. I want to give money to the arts. You can set up a field of interest fund. And when I talk more about endowments, basically the endowment spend down would go into the community foundation's grant making efforts around those issues every year. And then unrestricted funds, it can be you say you trust my local community foundation with this donation to do what they see fit with it, including covering operations and things like that. So all those types of funds are typically held. You might see some variation, because the old adage in the community foundation world is that if you've met one community foundation, you have met one community foundation. We function very differently across the board. So I mentioned like the Chicago Community Trust before, right? They're the sort of community foundation in our region that holds most of the sway and most of the power. They're structured very differently than we are. Like about 75% of their assets are actually donor advised funds, whereas we are about 60% board controlled. So like we make the decision around about 60% of our assets, right? And that really changes the way that you function, right? I know we've got a couple of community Chicago folks here. Like if you raise money from the Chicago Community Foundation, you might go into them and they'll sit you down with a donor advice fund holder, and that person or that group of people will decide if they want to make a grant to you. Whereas we typically do that through our program staff, and we have community-led grant-making panels. So our grant review panels are broad representations of the community. We actually have like 2 board members per review team. The vast majority of our people we're bringing in teachers, we're bringing in people who live in the community. We bring in people sometimes who are often beneficiaries of the programs that we're funding, because we want to get the whole swath of what Evanston is reviewing our grants, to make sure that our grants are best representations of what can positively impact the community. And so, community foundations can be very different. I've even met one that wouldn't accept any gifts unless it was made to the unrestricted endowment. So we really can be all over the map. And it means that every community foundation will really have, its own history, its own philosophy, its own strategic priorities. And for ECF, what that means is, we root all of our work in the philosophy of Ubuntu, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment for those who aren't familiar. But I also want to kind of talk about how ECF's history brought us there. So we're only about 37, 38 years old. For the first 15 years of our existence, we were actually a small fund of the United Way. Foundations are really weird. You can hold fund for another fund. And the Skokie Community Foundation used to be a donor advised fund at ECF before it spun off. So the community foundation world and foundations that can hold funds for other people get a little weird at times. For the first 15 years, we really just were starting making grants from the sale of a small building that started our endowment with about $150,000, with a few community representatives who wanted to, support issues, work on issues on the emerging and emergent needs of the community of Evanston. In 2001, we hired our first CEO, Sarah Shastak, still lives in the community today. It's a big help to me, but she really made us a foundation, started us raising actively for the endowment, building out some more of our funds, building all of our processes so we became more structured. And then in 2016, my immediate predecessor, Monique Brunson-Jones, so anybody who's in the Chicagoland area might know her now, is the CEO of Forefront. She was my predecessor in the role. Black woman who really started us thinking differently about what diversity and equity looks like within our organization. This may or may not surprise you, but we were real white up until about 6 years ago. in terms of our board, in terms of our staff, and all of that. And Monique really started us thinking differently, which was a really important and crucial moment for us because it started us down this pathway to where we could be prepared. Some of the work that we were doing before and the ways that we responded to community needs sort of planted the seeds for the ethos that we could evolve under Monique's leadership, but she was really the real turning point. And then in March of 2020, like the whole world, we had the record scratch moment, right? COVID came, and up until that point, the way that we reviewed grants was very traditional. We brought in an application, we decided what the grant cycle would look like, what the issue was that we were gonna fund in community. And our board reviewed all the applications. We had one big grant cycle and we threw a big event and we made everybody come in and talk about how great ECF was and why they got that grant, and we did things in a very white supremacy based way. We had to stop doing that during the pandemic because our community responded really well. We raised and put out about 5 times our normal grant making in one single year because our community said, we see all this need. It's one of the great things about being in a community of this size is you can wrap your arms around the need. We effectively ended homelessness. We effectively ended food insecurity in our community for about 2-3 years. Well, I don't know, I can't do it all the time if you can do it during that time period, but that's a whole other presentation. But one of the things that it caused us to do was start to bring more community voices into what we were doing, right? We couldn't keep up. Our board and our staff couldn't just keep up with what was going on in the community without talking actively to the community, right? And so while that moment was obviously tragic, right, with so many lives lost, so many, I had COVID, I still get a little chest, I swear I might still have a little bit of chest congestion from my COVID infection sometimes, right? The lasting effects will be that forever. But what we, the silver lining out of all of that is that we had to function differently. And then we learned that we could function differently, right? We learned that we could bring more community voice into our work. We learned that we could trust our community to make the decisions about what was best for our community. Radical, I know. But we realized we didn't have to be this stodgy old foundation and operate in the same ways that foundations always did. And so what I think we are today is just a much better listening organization, right? We're an organization that partners more deeply. We're a foundation that is not, here's your grant, we'll see you in 6 months and then again in a year, where we're helping organizations to, test new things. We're making grants to small businesses that are partnering with nonprofit organizations, particularly BIPOC and women-led businesses. One of our shining star examples of this is we have a Black woman who her family has been in Evanston for, 4 generations? Yeah, 4 generations. I got a couple of my staff here, Akila and Carly, so sometimes I might look, I'm a CEO, I don't know all the details. But her grandfather started Ebony Barbershop, which is one of the sort of staple Black barbershops in community. She's working with Family Focus, an organization in the 5th Ward here, which is Evanston's sort of historic Black ward. Family Focus is obviously a citywide organization, but this is Evanston's Family Focus, to do almost like pre-apprenticeship training around hair care and beautician stuff, and she's partnering with that organization. She's a small business. She does not have a 501c3, but through that partnership, we're able to make a grant. And she's doing this to teach young women from her community a career pathway because she wants to make a difference through her business. So we're doing unique things like that, all because we had this truly awful moment that we leveraged to turn into an organization that could meet the needs of our community during that time. Oh my Lord. All right, good. And so, what that kind of led us to was looking at philanthropy very differently. And I know some folks who have engaged with foundation people love to say that philanthropy means love of your fellow man, love of your fellow person, right? That is truly the Latin root of the word, but it has, in my opinion, nothing to do with the way philanthropy operates on a day-to-day basis, right? Philanthropy, the way it is now, is here's your check. I want to feel good about the check that I wrote for you, and don't talk to me again. And unless maybe I can give you another check, maybe I can support you in another way, but there's no true relationship there, and it's frankly just rooted in concept of sort of structures of white supremacy, right? It's those who have can give unto those who can, and you should be grateful for our dollars. You should do whatever we tell you to do to prove that you're worthy of our dollars. And Ubuntu, for those who aren't familiar, is just a fundamentally different principle. I spell it out here, I put the pronunciation up here. It's not like a dictionary, what you would find in Webster's dictionary, but it's Ubuntu. It's a Southern African term that means I am because we are, or I am because you are. And there's a little story that I found online that I like to read for folks who aren't familiar with the concept. If you don't mind, I'll share that with you now. So an anthropologist is studying the habits and customs of an African tribe and found himself surrounded by children most days. He decided to play a little game with them. He managed to get candy from the nearest town and put it all in a decorated basket at the foot of a tree. Then he called the children and suggested they play the game. When the anthropologist said now, the children had to run to the tree, and the first one to get there could have all the candy to him or herself. So the children all lined up, waiting for the signal. When the anthropologist said now, all of the children took each other by the hand and ran together towards the tree. They all arrived at the same time and divided up the candy, sat down, and began to happily munch away. The anthropologist went over to them and asked why they had all run together when any one of them could have had all the candy to themselves. And the children responded, Ubuntu. How could any one of us be happy if all the others were sad? I love that. I'm an emotional person. I get a little foggy every time I read it. To tell you, I cry like every event that we have. I cry every single time. And this one is one of those stories that gets me because it really is like so different than the way our world operates today, right? Like we're all so worried about how much can I get, right? We worship billionaires, right? Like we worship large corporations. We worship these things in our culture. And we've lost sense of the fact that like for people to get that much, people have to be left behind, right? It's just the way it has to work. If you want that much, I think there's a certain amount of wealth you can get to, but like when you start talking about $200, $300, $400 billion, like there's just no way to get that without harming, without destroying, without taking away and snatching. And Evanston is such a small community. To think about like someone being able to grab all those resources when others can't get it is just sinful, right? It just is. And so, we wanted to start thinking differently about the way that we brought the community together as the community's foundation. And so the way we look at Ubuntu as our philosophy is that we're only functioning, our primary role in this community is to ensure that everyone in our community has an opportunity to thrive. Because we bring in donations from the wealthiest of our community, and we work with organizations that serve the most marginalized community in our community, we have an opportunity to bring those people together and see their commonalities, see where they, this is an 8 square mile community. And we have our share of segregation, to be sure. It's amazing how easily human beings can segregate even within 8 square miles. You saw that folded map project. We could probably do a little bit of that in Evanston ourselves, right? Despite only being the size of like one city ward in Chicago, but we are inextricably linked. There are studies out there that show, that the violence that happens in Chicago, which is a small part of the vibrant, dynamic, community of Chicago. I work in Evanston now. I worked in West Englewood. I've worked in Bronzeville. I've worked in Pilsen. I've worked all over this city. I've seen so much beauty here. So don't let the news try to tell you what Chicago's all about. Even in West Englewood, I've seen incredible people build community every day. Even in these communities that you're hearing all the bad stories about, there's so much beauty there. So I don't mean this to denigrate any one community. But what I'm saying is we know it's a challenge that we face in this community. And every single person who lives in Chicagoland is psychologically affected by that. There have been multiple studies done. So that means that we're also psychologically affected by healing that together, right? This is not, we lose by letting some people get left so far behind. Every single one of us do, right? And so as a community foundation, we feel the deep responsibility to use our efforts in community to break those barriers down. And that sort of leads to our strategic plan, which I'm not gonna read our whole strategic plan. It's like a 40-page work plan that I know Akila and Carly probably hate. But I do want to talk a little bit about how reparations shows up here. So the first pillar of our plan is elevating the voices of our community. So, the two things that we really care deeply about, two of the things that apply, to reparations here are prioritizing the repair of barriers to equity and racial justice in our grant making, and supporting our community advocacy efforts and collective impact initiatives. So those are, two pillars that really connect with reparations there. The next pillar is building justice and resiliency. So we're building and collaborating on programs that will specifically improve family economic stability, including supporting and expanding reparations work in Evanston. And we wrote that word intentionally into our strategic plan, and I'll tell you why a little bit later, but it's important to have the word in there. The next is supporting nonprofits and building the capacity to effectively serve the Evanston community. We'll talk a little bit about the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston, which is the true leader, a community organization leader of Evanston's reparations programming. We are deeply in partnership with them. I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. And then the other one is just making sure that we're strengthening ourselves through this Ubuntu philosophy, and that we're holding ourselves accountable to the values that we espouse out in the community. I'm sure all of you have gone to a foundation that says you gotta be working on equity, you gotta be working on justice, and they don't have anyone who's not wealthy and white engaged in any of the decision-making processes in their organization, right? Like, we can't be that way and ask other people to do this work that we're doing. And so we're making sure that we're holding ourselves accountable internally. And so a little bit about how that shows up is I, like to talk a little bit about, I talked about the harm that gets done in our community and how it impacts everyone. When I talk about reparations with people, I sort of think about this idea of the Black experience in America is like similar to being cut for like 400 years, right? Slavery, Jim Crow, the continued sort of marginalization, disinvestment of our communities, of our people, through intentional practices that exist in our society, have been cuts and rubbing dirt in the wound and doing all of these things to make it worse. We often see a lot of backlash to reparations, even within our own community. I think a lot of that is because when you are fighting against oppressive systems, their assumption is that reparations means cutting back. It means that we want to return that cut. When we're just asking to be healed, right? We're just asking for bandages, and Neosporin and all those things that heal the cut. Again, that healing work will heal the whole community because we know that people are affected, right? We know that it doesn't actually serve even our best economic interests to have people who can't afford to live, right? We know, and it's still done without regard to that. And so the healing really matters. And it's, obviously there's this link to the spirit of Ubuntu, right? Like if you can understand like this thing that's been proven by research that it's true to how we exist as people, that your well-being is inextricably linked to another's humanity, right? Reparations just makes sense. And so that's part of the reason why we brought it to the forefront to our work. And then, we do that work through a partnership with an organization called the Reparations Stakeholders Authority of Evanston. And this is really, really important. So the Reparations Stakeholders Authority, I'm assuming everyone in this room at least is familiar that Evanston was the first community to pass municipal reparations. City governments are limited in terms of what they can do with that money because of municipal statutes, right, and state laws. And some of you are probably familiar with the Bloom Group, the group that sued, that overturned affirmative action. They are going after foundations, they're going after universities, they're going after anything race-based now. Once again, sort of laws and things that were designed to protect people of color, or initially in their concept, are now being used to harm people of color, right? Like anti-lynching laws, more Black kids in the South go to get in trouble for anti-lynching laws than anyone else, right? Like those are the sort of things that we see popping up. But the Reparations Stakeholder Authority was a community-led group that came after that said, we want to be able to do all the other things that a municipal government can't do through reparations, right? We want to build a fund and raise a fund to be able to do that. And so they came to the Evanston Community Foundation. They were not yet a 501c3. We set ourselves up as the fiscal sponsor of that organization. It's actually interesting, a couple of times we were the fiscal sponsor. We made a grant to them. So it was like making a grant to ourselves in a weird way to support them. It was kind of a funky time. They have their 501c3 now, which has cleared up some of that. We've got some wonders in our finance and operations team that were able to work all of that funky language out to make sure that we could do that legally. Again, another great reason to partner with foundations, because we have the capacity to be able to do those sort of things that a lot of other organizations in the community don't, right? Like we have the team that we have and all of that. We also, meet with this group regularly at their request. We hold the fund. So this fund, we hold the funds. They've raised just about $1 million into this fund, largely from our faith-based community. In fact, on Martin Luther King weekend this year, 2023, 19 faith-based organizations made pledges or donations in the amount of about $894,000 into the Community Reparations Fund, with a commitment to return. So looking forward to was the third Sunday in January, fourth Sunday in January again this year to see what we come about. But our faith-based institutions really stepped up. We've raised significant amounts of money to put in there. And the RSAE has decided they want to endow half of that money, an endowment. It's good to see you, sir. And I'll talk about endowment, but endowment basically means that you hold money in a fund where we invest on behalf. We invest all of our funds together. We're very fortunate to have pro bono support, so we don't pay any fund management fees. We pay like transaction fees like everyone does, but we're able to hold these funds, invest them so that the funds grow over time, and then you take a draw out of that amount that is less than what the fund grows over time. So what that means is if you put $100,000 in the Evanston Community Foundation when we started, that money would have made about $200,000 worth of grants, and still be worth $300,000 in our endowment. Right, so that's like how endowment works. It grows and can work at the same time. You don't get the big chunk right off the bat, but work like this is long-term work, and so it's sort of like building the patience in with the real-time work. So our faith-based organization stepped up, raised a lot of money. We've had donations from the community. We've also, we helped launch the organization. We provided fiscal sponsorship. We made grants to them for staffing, and we partner and do regular strategy meetings and building collaborations around this. Some of you may see Matt Feldman. He was one of our speakers today. He's the treasurer for First Repair. He's also our board treasurer. He's helped connect the RSAE with banking partners and community to allow some of these funds to be used in different ways because they were having a lot of trouble bringing in financial institutions to partner on some of the dollars and things like that. So we've really provided all of that at the request, and I will say this every time, this is at the request of the RSAE. And I'll talk a little bit about why I say that so many times, because sort of have a three-pronged approach to how we work in reparations. Anybody who played high school sports has probably heard this before, right? Like you either lead, you follow, or you get out of the way. And so we try to use those principles as the way that we operate, and I'll talk a little bit about what each of those mean. So first, going into lead, you lead is a foundation. A foundation should lead minimally. And I talk a lot about this at like foundation conferences, because one thing that foundations love to do is we love to like toot our own horn about helping somebody with a grant and just controlling the way everything happens, right? So we put money in, but do it our way, and then we'll take all the credit and we'll take nice pictures with you and say, hey, we're this equitable organization because look what we did to help these poor folks. So you really have to be conscious here. And I say this particularly as a Black foundation leader. A Black-led foundation does not mean a Black-centered foundation, right? And I think even a lot of Black leaders make this mistake, right? Is we think like, okay, we're in this seat, but that doesn't change the foundational principles in which you operate. It doesn't change the spirit of the organization. It doesn't change the ethos of the organization. We still operate in a lot of these principles. So like, it's really important that your leadership is really just in a couple of key ways. And I think some of the, a couple of key ways is just really speaking to peer organizations about understanding better what reparations even means, right? Like a lot of your leadership should be with other organizations to bring them around to the right mindset to do it. And also around opening doors for the community members who truly lead the work, right? Like if Black community leaders were able to access these seats of power, reparations would have happened already, right? Foundations have connections to folks in these seats of power, and we're able to use those. So you should be able to open those doors and step back, right? That's the extent of what foundation leadership should look like in this space. There's a lot more space to follow than there is to lead. Some of that is investing in repair work. I say this all the time. Equity and repair are not the same thing. And some of you may have seen this. I work with Robin. She's been invited to apply for grants that people said, hey, under our equity work, we want to fund reparations. And then she gets to the last decision and like, oh, this is actually a little more than what we thought it was. We can't give you any money anymore, right? Like, is equity and repair not the same thing, right? So you have to be, really mindful of that. And so, that might mean making changes to your strategic priorities. It might mean making changes to the way you talk about your organization, but you do have to be specific, as I said earlier, about calling out the word repair, calling out reparations. That's why we put it in our strategic plan, is because, one day they might fire me. It happens. And I wanted to be in there when I'm gone, right? I wanted to be in there when I'm gone because I can't be, and the staff that's here with us today can't be the only ones carrying that message, right? And so as you're talking with foundation partners and community, they have to come with this commitment to talk about repair.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it appropriate?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, because I know, well, I'm in Atlanta, and we have a phenomenal community foundation wish I knew.
I have a friend who works there.
Yeah.
Cristiano, do you know Cristiano?
No, but I know some of
Okay.
the people
Yeah.
that kind of work with us on this. So I know a lot of times people see things that are happening now and know that something needs to be done about what's happening with black kids, for example, now. So when you say repair, could you give us some examples? Because a lot of times people think, you know, well, my thoughts are repair has to do with what has happened in the past and repairing and doing something, investing in the work that happened in the past, as opposed to what has actually happened recently. So could you give us some distinction? Because I think it's always kind of muddy there.
Yeah, I think any good repair should last beyond the period of the repair done, right? If you think about like, if you get a car repair done, right, it shouldn't just be about, you know, fixing the brakes and bringing it up to the like worst case state that it will still kind of work, right? If you get new brakes, you want a whole new brake pad, right? You want a whole new rotor so that the brakes work for time after that, right? So I think about repair, it's about thinking about long-term investments. So there are some things that need to be, you know, done in the past, right? Done for the past, and like, I guess an example, if you look at the city's municipal reparations, I think is, you know, a localized example. So the first wave of money went into housing. And sort of what happened is the commission made the decision, you know, to sort of think about, and folks know, evidence of reparations is around redlining, 1919 to 1969. If you or one of your ancestors lived in the community during that time, you're eligible. So we took care of the ancestors first, right? And actually, it was a proud moment this year. I think all of the ancestors as part of that program received it, that had applied, were eligible, received their payment, had received their payment at some point this year, right? So you're thinking about shoring up the historical wrongdoing. Folks use those for housing repairs, to catch up on mortgages, to do those sort of things. And then there's also, the next stage is for the descendants, right? The folks who are who came after the folks who were harmed. And there you have an opportunity to start thinking about, right? And as we start moving into the next phases, it's about investing in education, investing in community economic development, right? So if you're thinking about how do we make sure that we shore up the educational systems for young black children living in Evanston today? How do we support black businesses for young black entrepreneurs so that when they put that money can be there to build economic stability? And that's why reparations lives under at least in our strategic plan, it lives under the pillar of building justice and resiliency, right? So it's about buffering the community against things that come in the future through resiliency. So it's about kind of staging the investments of repair. It's all coming in, the investment is all coming to right the wrong, but you might look at this differently when you're thinking about how you're investing in younger folks in our community versus people who were maybe harmed historically, who lived in the community during that
How does
historic
that
period.
differ from a government, you know, like the city of Atlanta? They're going to provide funds for kids who need tutoring or whatever after school because of COVID and all.
Mhm.
How does the repair work differ from what local governments may be doing already? There may be funds in local government for what you're talking about now. So I'm just trying to distinguish that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest elements of talking about repair work is actually the acknowledgement of the harm,
Yeah.
and that's the reason for the investment. Some of that might even just be a spiritual difference more so than a technical difference, quite frankly.
The city councilman can say, hey, we are doing this already, so why would we invest in the community foundation repair work when we are doing it over here? Is there competition?
Yeah, well-
I'm concerned about the competition between the dollars. United Way.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, it's big time doing work.
Absolutely.
That could be, compared to what you suggest here.
Yeah, and I will say another piece of this that's really important is because the historical acknowledgement of the harm, what it allows to do is that, you know, a lot of times what happens is these programs are for income levels. And of course, like, I've worked in this field for a long time. I believe that anyone who's living in poverty should be helped. There was specific harm done to black folks, and as we talked about some of the movements that are going on the conservative end of our political spectrum to push back on a lot of that stuff, the acknowledgement of harm and the specific acknowledgement of things that are documented to have happened in our community allows you to focus these efforts specifically on a community that was harmed, rather than saying anyone who's of this income level can benefit from it, right? And that's actually why the redlining thing was such an interesting thing, right? And a lot of folks have talked about, well, we want, you know, slavery reparations for slavery. We want lineage-based reparations for slavery. And I think like that should be the goal that everyone is working for here. But we have documented history of houses being picked up from along the lakefront in Evanston and moved to West Evanston, right? And so we're talking about the folded map project here. You saw a woman in Rogers Park whose house was worth like $400,000 and her equivalent of then is $90,000. Like, that's wealth lost over generations and generations and generations, right? When you're picking that up, and you can focus in specifically on the populations that were harmed there, and not say this is just for anybody who doesn't have enough money right now.
Can I make a comment too? To that point.
Sure.
Okay, yeah,
let's
just quickly, I think another thing I think about too, in addition to that, is that a reparations program should be going back and saying, how do we repair harm to the kids that have already been through the school system, that are maybe 40, 50, 60 now, even, or grown, but not just the kids that are going through the system now. So that's another way I think about it too.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm here, Phyllis is a part of this work as well, but I'm here on behalf of the Reparations Stakeholder Authority of Asheville. And so to your question about the competition, particularly around the funding that comes from governmental, control versus the Reparations Stakeholder Authority operates, at least for us, it's coming from more of a philanthropic perspective. I think we see it largely as well as a couple different avenues, one being power, so the power of disseminating those dollars and the control over those dollars with the stakeholder authority is through us, right? Like through Black community, our members, versus being beholden to governmental oversight, right? In that way, of course, we're beholden to the IRS, but outside of the nonprofit status, right? And then the other piece is that the government, the local authorities have responsibility to pay out, right? Like reparations through those dollars, right? That they gain from taxes, all those ill-begotten dollars. But we also have these other ways that we can support folks who are seeking to, maybe through their own family trusts, other different avenues, to also be a part of reparations. And those dollars shouldn't be held by government. So we operate in a way where we provide that avenue for all of these different types of repair to be going back into our community. So that's what I say about the difference with the competition and the funding.
No, that's a really great point. It was actually a little bit on my next slide, and I appreciate you doing it.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It should be. I wanted to be a conversation, and I'm so glad to see the Asheville Stakeholder Authority here. I think we had a couple folks at the first symposium that we talked to, and then we had a couple of conversations with the folks at the Zedek Foundation, and so glad to see you all just like growing and doing great work. That's so powerful. But what you spoke to there was really about the third prong of the philosophy is getting out of the way. And that's what we talk about, that like giving space for Black leaders to specifically take the wheel, right? For the decision-making power to be held with the community, to be held with, the folks who have been harmed, right? The folks who have made the investment of time and energy to build those things out. And certainly the foundation partnerships and the community foundation partnerships give opportunity for folks to bring other dollars in. But this is the biggest piece, right? Is this. The biggest way for a foundation to function, the best way for a foundation to partner, is to provide the resources, support, and infrastructure, and then let Black folks have the power, right? And that is probably the hardest thing for foundations to do, is to give that up, right? Is to say, money is power in this society that we live in, right? But to be able to say, we're going to give this support and then back off and let other folks make the decision, is like, you've got to have a soul-searching moment as a foundation to be able to do that, because it's frankly going to overturn everything that foundations doing this overturns every single way that we've done grant making in our community, in our world for forever, right? And so we're really kind of backing it up, but that's to say, toppling an oppressive system requires sacrifice. Can you give up resources, control, access, and money, and give up control? So, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for adding that.
Can I share one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm part of a community of repair, a community of reparations, and so many different folks. And so I just want to share a testimony, okay? So actually, I'm a first-time homeowner last year, but it was because a group of people came together, the powers in the people, right, to say who've done their own personal money stories, history of the money in their family, where they got the money from and on whose expense. And they actually were a part of my being able to purchase the house with funds. And then my agent, who's also doing her own work, she said, I cannot take any kind of commission for this. She gave me the check. Okay?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And then somebody else gave me money, $5,000 for furniture. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a word right there.
Right.
And I'll tell you, I appreciate what you said, the powers of the people. And, we have this really complicated relationship with the word power, right? And I think it's because in the system that we live, the power that we think of is power over, right? And for those of you, all of you here are community organizers, whether you see yourselves as that or not, right? But in the organizing world, we talk about is power with, power together, as opposed to power over. And that's power with, right? That is people being power together and saying, like, I am investing in my folks to be strengthened, right? That's power together. And, and I think, like, again, another important soul-searching moment for our society to do is to think about how do we build power together as opposed to always thinking about taking power back. It's also one of the reasons why this work is so challenging to do, because an oppressive system cannot understand the concept of power together versus power over. Right? If you only leverage power over, you'll never understand power together. And so, again, that's why this community-based work is so important, because we're changing changing how we see power in our world that's how it works. It's not just about the checks getting cut. It's not just about building the funds, right? It's about changing the way that we see this stuff operating in our society. So,
and our collective healing.
That's right, and healing together. Right, exactly. And we have to be healed to have all that power together. So I appreciate that. I told you I'm Kojic. I can handle a good testimony, for sure. That's right. So, I'll talk a little bit about why it helps to partner with community foundations. So I talked a little bit about the power of endowment, right? Like most foundations hold an endowment, right? Most foundations, their dollars are endowed. Now, if you got, whatever $1 billion, the draw from your endowment is going to be a little larger than a smaller community foundation. So this is a partnership. Community foundations are important to partner there. But the unique thing about community foundations is that we can roll funds. All those different fund types that I talked about earlier can be rolled into our endowment. And different foundations have different levels of ability to function in that way, right? To hold the donor and endowment for an individual or for an agency, right? Like the RSAE fund at ECF is an agency fund. This is a nonprofit organization that is running this work, that is receiving donations from community. We hold the fund. They make the decisions on how the funds are leveraged, because that's the way we draw up the fund agreement. And our commitment is we've made grants to support the staffing of the organization, and we're not charging any fees. One day they might get bigger than us. We might have to renegotiate someday. We'll see how it goes right now. And then the other piece is the power of donor intent, right? I mentioned before, the Bloom Group, they're coming after foundations. They're coming after universities. Donor intent can get you past a few of those hurdles, right? If a donor says, this is my money and I want it to go to this, that's a different situation than an organization saying, I'm going to do this with or a university saying, we're going to make our scholarship funds available for this, right? Donor intent has a lot of power in the law, because, this isn't some, entity that's getting tax-free status. It's a human being saying, I want to do this with my money. Right, and that's just a different thing, and it's not going to be a complete cover for everything, but donor intent does provide a cover, and so that's actually why, a community foundation and working another type of designated fund, being a donor advised fund, can provide cover for there. I think it's also unique that, the board and often the staff at a community foundation have ties to the community, right? This isn't, you see a lot of like private foundations, right? Where those folks will fly in from all over the country and they just meet where the money's origin is from, but they don't live there. They're not tied to any of those things. They don't care about necessarily what happens in the local community. Our board all lives or works in Evanston. Most of our staff live or work in Evanston. Carly's family has been here for 27 generations or something like that. No, I'm just kidding. No, she's the fourth generation Evanstonian, right? It matters. When we're doing this work here, Akila grew up in Evanston, right? I live here. My son was born here. This work that we're doing, we're touching the lives of people whose blood runs in our veins, right? That's a different level of investment, right? It matters. And so I think that's really important. And then going back to the definition of the community foundation, it is our job, our responsibility. We are defined by supporting the community from which our dollars were raised, right? We don't get to set some mission that says we're the Evanston Community Foundation and we're going to support a country 1,000 miles from here. We have to be for Evanston. That's what we're designed to do. it's a fundamental different way of kind of looking at it. And so I think like just the design of community foundations uniquely positions us to be able to do some of this stuff in a different way. And so, you know, when you start thinking about partnering with a community foundation, I think some of the important measures, and I'll talk a little bit more about these, are strategic alignment, Black community leadership, skin in the game, commitment to partner and support, and a commitment to play the long game. So first, strategic alignment. I'll go back to what I said before. Community foundation, your foundation partner needs to use the word reparations or repair, needs to talk about it specifically. I think it's important to have that continuum, right? We've had a big sort of push around using the word equity in our society. We sort of stopped there, and now we've been rolling it back, right? All these like departments of equity and all these these places, folks are getting fired and laid off, and they're closing down all of this because it's 3.5 years later, and apparently nobody cares about anything that happened in 2020 anymore, right? That's kind of what happened. So again, using the word, writing it down, and making sure that it does not just live with a few people, right? I talk a lot to my peer organizations here when I say this, but I think it's really important for you all as you're working with your foundation partners to start thinking about how this stuff gets documented in that way, right? They, the very least, need to be strategic priorities. And again, going back to the power of endowment, once you write it down, once you put it in a fund agreement, if somebody says, I want to fund the Reparations Stakeholder Authority of Evanston out of this fund, it's nigh impossible to go back and change that, right? And so, like, you know, writing it down, putting it in these documents and all these sort of things are incredibly important. And putting the, you know, at some part of your organization's existence, you have to write down the commitment of this and making sure it's not just, reparations is not just here because of the collection of people we have in the organization right now.
Right, that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So you need Black community leadership. It's absolutely true, right? Repair takes buy-in from outside the Black community, right? It does. You have, the repair should come from outside the Black community. So you have to have buy-in. You know, voluntary, coerced, forced, or whatever, it's gotta happen, right? And partnership across communities is important. I'm gonna tell you, when we sat in the church on Martin Luther King Day and see the full expanse of Evanston, a lot of people think about Evanston and we think about, like, you know, the lakefront and Northwestern and all of that, but Evanston is an incredibly diverse community, particularly relative to our other North Shore neighbors, right? You get like 2 or 3 communities north of here. We are in some of the wealthiest communities per capita in the entire United States, right? Evanston was one of the few communities in this area that, you know, during the period of de facto segregation, as they would call it, right? Like, that allowed Black folks to live in their community. There's only a few communities on the North Shore. So like, Wilmette didn't have any, they still barely have any Black folks. Kenilworth, Winnetka, all those places that are north of us. There's a few communities. And we just know if you have Black folks, you have poverty, right? That's just a part of the existence in America. And so we've always had racial, and then being a university town, bringing in an international presence, there's always been racial diversity, there's always been a socioeconomic diversity here that does not exist. A lot of people will say, I don't completely agree with this because of some other structures, but Evanston and probably like Oak Park, which is another suburb on the west side, are probably the suburbs that most closely mirror like what Chicago looks like on a much smaller scale, right? Don't completely agree, but if you kind of took a snapshot of our community, we're the closest to like population representation and all that sort of stuff. Although, you know, our communities of color are declining because it's getting crazy expensive to live here, to be honest. But that's a whole other thing that we need to start working on repair for as well, right? But you know, it is really powerful to step into a space where you're talking about reparations. You get to see like representation of the whole wide world talking about this is valuable to us. And you all saw Al Tillery here. You know, he's been doing some research, and it's really surprising the numbers of people from across the racial spectrum of America that are in favor of reparations here in Evanston has beat any other survey that's been done in any community across the country ever, right? The majority of our community is in favor of that, and I think, you know, that's a testament to how we've worked as a community together. I think it's also a testament, you know, people make their own decisions about their faith, and I don't make any judgments there one way or another, but I think it's a testament to working through faith-based communities, because our times that we're in church or we're in temple or we're wherever are some of the most segregated hours in America. So if we're coming together and talking about what repair looks like in these periods of time, it's important to like having these conversations and talking about it. We have folks in our you know, in our temple talking about the Judaic faith-based case for reparations, right? That's happening in places of worship here, talking about how these texts of faith show that we should be providing repair to people who have been harmed in our community. That changes mindsets in an important way, and I think, so partnerships across the community are important, but back to the point that you made, the acceptable means of repair and leadership still stay in the hands of the Black community, right? So people can come together to decide to do repair, and then Black folks decide what repair looks like. A commitment to partner and support. This is again speaking to foundations. So this means you show up when you're needed. It doesn't mean you show up and hover. It doesn't mean you're making decisions. It doesn't mean you're controlling. It means that when you are asked for support, you offer it. And again, it's a delicate balance. But we meet monthly with the Reparations Stakeholder Authority of Evanston, again, at their request. We offer whatever support is needed. We offer whatever partnership is needed. Matter of fact, I didn't even know I was speaking at this thing until like last week. And Robin was like, what does your presentation look like? And I was like, I'm gonna show up and put something together, right? So that's kind of, you know, I show up whenever Robin, Reverend Neighbors, Dino Robinson, all those sort of things. This is another piece I wanna add. It's not a part of our, of my presentation, but we've seen a lot of leadership here, and you all who did the bus tour, Dino led the bus tour. He leads an organization called Shorefront Legacy Center, an incredibly important organization in the work of repair here. He has spent, close to 20 years documenting the history of Black folks on the North Shore, and the research that he was doing proved to be the anchor of the proof points for some of the things that led to repair. So this is another opportunity for some of your foundations to start investing in like keepers of Black history, keepers of Black stories, right? Keepers of these things that happen to Black folks, right? That we know, like that house lifting thing happened more than once, and he has record of every time it happened, right? Like that matters, right? And so we talk about steps to repair. These story things that you're keeping, actually you and I were talking the other day about like Miss Orr, Miss Gwen, I worked in West Inglewood, and like these were women who lived in Inglewood for 40, 50 years. They have stories about what happened, and like documenting those stories are so incredibly important. While we have our ancestors with us, folks who have, who have lived through some of this history, we gotta collect those stories now, and they get lost so often. I think it's just another important piece as you're building this repair work. Don't lose the story. Don't lose the storytelling and the collection and documentation of it. It's incredibly important. It's incredibly powerful.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, like when I saw the description about this, it was like how to start a fund.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're doing like this presentation is like kind of for foundations, but for nonprofits who are not community foundations, are you saying to start a reparations fund, you need to be a community foundation, or?
Oh, no, yeah, and
yeah,
that's a great point. So I will say like it's no, you don't need to be a community foundation.
Okay.
It's important to have a philanthropic organization partner to set up these funds.
Okay.
It's important to identify these values, the strategic alignment within, and help build these values within the fund. The starting of the fund as a mechanism is not an incredibly complicated process, right? Like if you walked into our foundation and said you want to start a donor advised fund, we could have a donor advised fund ready for you in an hour. All right, we got templates, we got all this stuff. We might negotiate over some specifics, but the starting of the fund can be done in a very brief period of time. So to me, as I look at the starting of the fund is really about like working with partners and pushing partners and pushing your foundation partners to start thinking about these levels of strategic alignment, because the hurdle is going to be the resources that go into the fund and the investment and support that you get from the foundation. If the strategic alignment isn't there, the mechanism of the fund is not incredibly complicated. Most any foundation, I would say like even the conversations we have with Zedek, am I saying that right? It's Zedek? Yeah, with that foundation, we're not really about like fund mechanism. Now there might be some specifics, like I said, before the RSAE was an organization, we provided fiscal sponsorship to them, and so there were some complexities in terms of like making grants to an entity where we were the fiscal sponsor. But again, most foundations have the ability within their organization to do those sort of things. We're the fiscal sponsor for Evanston Cradle to Career, and we give, you know, grants into that as well, right? Like we do that sort of thing. It's more complex legally. But the conversation that we had with Zedek was more about like these sort of elements, right? These sort of elements about how do you build up the community leadership mechanism. So as you're thinking about an organization, I would go back and think about like, you know, how, you know, what's the historical documentation process that I mentioned before to track the harm that's happened? The more specific you can be, the better, because all these legal challenges that are coming down the pike, those are the biggest, those are gonna be the things that determine whether this, you know, whether this convening of folks we have doing it is gonna be just a meeting we have, or it's gonna be the beginning of a tidal wave, right? So, yes.
Did Dino know he was helping to build a case for reparations
I don't-
when he started creating the archive?
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so. He's been doing it for 20 years. And there were obviously been movements going on, but he is an archivist at Northwestern University, and this was almost like a side project that he started. Just tracking, he moved to this community. Evanston's weird, a little weird, like, you know, in the black community here is a little weird, like if you weren't born here, sometimes you're not necessarily like an Evanston person until you get stuff
It ain't just Evanston.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not.
I feel the same way.
Yeah,
As
so-
somebody not from Asheville, I can tell you, yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, so he did it really as a way, you know, who moved here after he was born, he did it as a way to connect with the community that he like grew up in but wasn't born in. I mean, he moved here sometime in grade school, and lived here and went away and is an archivist, and this is his passion, and he just started tracking. And he's tracked stuff all along the North Shore. Like he's tracked, the black history is less in some of the other communities, right? There's fewer folks, fewer things to track, but he's tracked the entire thing. So he's got like, you know, campaign flyers from, you know, the first black alderman elected and all those sort of things. He's been tracking all of that for a very long time. He even, you know, Evanston's 5th Ward School was closed 60 years ago, something like that. And it was just passed, well, it's a little complicated now because of all the stuff that we won't get into, but there was, the school board decided to rebuild the school, and Dino ran in and grabbed a t-shirt, right? Like those are the sort of things, you know, a t-shirt that some people had printed up to have that historical documentation, right? So it's about tracking the legacy, tracking the history. You know, you can do that now. A lot of this stuff still exists in folks' family Bibles. It still exists on bookshelves, right? You know, you go to your grandmother's house right now, right? You can pull down, you know, stuff like that. My grandparents would, like, had letters from Edgar Evers in their house, right? Just like sitting in the Bible, that, you know, and all that sort of stuff, right? Like those things exist, so we track those things down. And then it's about building community leadership, forming an organization or an entity. You might already have that in place. Your organizations might be already positioned to do it, but an entity like the RSAE that is black-led and black-centered. And I would say 100% black-led, quite frankly. And that doesn't mean other folks can't partner, but when you talk about the leadership and decision-making, that needs to be there. And then you want to identify a funding partner, a philanthropic partner that has the values that are going into place, that are put into place right here, right, that are talking about these sort of things.
One of the things I just wanted to point out is, you know, I'm a historian, so historians do this all the time. And the major organization where historians are related to is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. It's called ASALH. And it founded in 1915 by Carter G. Woodson. We established Black History Month. So there may be, you know, instead, you know, you do some personal things that you indicate, you know, with your Bibles and all, but I'm sure that a lot of the stories of communities, black communities across the country, have been written by historians. So you won't have to kind of feel like, you know, I gotta go and do all of this. That might already exist depending on what community you come from. But I have a different question. Point. Okay, most people think of reparations, especially us black folk, which I'm one of. Where's my check? Okay, so with the stakeholders authority, what is your response to that with this Ubuntu philosophy? Like, it seems to me you were suggesting, I see the perspective is that you see a harm, you let folk know it's a harm, either donor or whoever wants to do that, government, and they give you money. But what about the people, how do you respond to people like, where's my check?
Yeah, well, the fund is raised in part to be able to do those things. So the RSAE has a board comprised of people, and there are "Where's my check" people on that board, right? You know, you all know the UN, there's those, and I forget, there's the promise of cessation of harm. There is the education, and all those sort of things, right? All of those elements are on the table under the definition of repair for the RSAE. Right, and so the idea of this RSAE work is to invest these funds into those things. So one of the things that happened is that initially, the city has changed its program. Initially, what the city of Evanston's program was they would pay contractors to do work, so they weren't giving money directly to the harmed, right? They've changed that. Now the check does go to the people to be able to do that because there was significant community push against that, and that mattered. But that was part of the reason why the RSAE came to us initially, was that there are some people who just want a check and deserve a check. And that's under the banner of what this work does as the fund grows, right? So, we leave a lot of that structure, and what happens with the dollars, that's the decision of the RSAE as they move forward. But they made, some of it is about, art installations in community, right? That are historical documentation of things that happen. Some of it's really dependent upon what the community is
So the check has to
wanting.
be related to something that is proven to have harm.
Not the
just
RSAE
being
check, the
black.
city's check. So
Just not being
we
black.
have two programs here. So the city of Evanston's check has to be documented harm.
Okay,
The RSAE's check does not.
okay.
It does not. And then, and that was another one of the things here, is that Evanston's always had a relatively large Jamaican population, Haitian population, Belizean population. We have, Caribbean black folks here and there.